The third of these young Italian immigrants was Vito Genovese, born 3 days after Luciano on November 27, 1897, in Rosolino, Italy, near Naples. He moved to New York with his family at the age of 16. The Genoveses settled in Queens, where Vito's father ran a small construction business. But Vito was drawn to the excitement of Manhattan and soon moved in with some relatives in Little Italy.
Vito was a thug from get-go. He was a crook from, from the day he was able to walk his first steps.
Vito Genovese was a street guy, a guy who was quick to use violence, murder, the mob hit to settle an issue.
Even as a boy, Vito had dreamed of joining the underworld. In 1917, the burly 20-year-old was arrested for the first time for carrying a gun. He was sentenced to 60 days in jail. Soon after, Genovese joined Costello and Charlie Luciano's gang. At the time, the New York underworld was dominated not by Italians, but by Jewish gangsters. Luciano's savvy business style attracted the attention of a notorious Jewish mobster, Arnold Rothstein, who was looking for promising young delinquents to run his criminal operations.
Luciano was the first person in organized crime of Italian parentage who said, "I will work with others." Two of his closest allies were Meyer Lansky and Ben Siegel, two men of the Jewish faith. He said, "I trust them. We work well together. We can make money. I don't care that they are not Italians."
While Luciano and Costello gladly worked with Jewish gangsters, Genovese refused to do business with non-Italians.
Vito Genovese, he used to say to Costello, "Frank, what are we doing all these Hebes around?" Costello would look at him and say, "Shut up, Vito. You're an immigrant yourself."
Rothstein was a powerful mentor, but something even more powerful was about to reshape the New York underworld and present the three Italian boys with a golden opportunity. In 1920, Prohibition went into effect.
Prohibition gave the mob its financial base. It brought so much money into them that they were able to branch out into other areas.
With Rothstein's guidance, the ambitious young Italians learned how to grease the right palms in New York's corrupt democratic machine, known as Tammany Hall. With the right payoffs to politicians, police, and district attorneys, they could run their bootlegging operations with no interference.
These were men who had very limited education, but they learned American politics very well. They learned that if you gave support, political contributions in cash, which could not be traced, that you could get politicians, if elected to office, who would be beholden to you.
Only one thing stood in the way of Luciano, Costello, and Genovese: the old Sicilian bosses, the men of respect who still lorded over the Italian underworld. As Prohibition turned into the biggest mob racket ever, the Sicilian bosses began fighting a bloody street war. Luciano worked for Joe the Boss Masseria. Masseria's rival, Salvatore Maranzano, wanted Luciano to work for him. When Lucky refused, it nearly cost him his life.
He was picked up by four gangsters at around 50th Street in New York City and taken out and beaten and left for dead.
And then they just dumped his body and he made his way back alive. And his friends, when they heard about it, are supposed to have said, "You were lucky to come out of that alive." And that's how he got the nickname Lucky, which stayed with him all of his days.
The attack left Lucky with a droopy eyelid and a hideous scar across his chin. It also convinced him that the old bosses had to go. With help from his Jewish allies, Luciano arranged the murders of both Masseria and Maranzano. Now, in his moment of victory, Luciano decided to create an operation that was far more powerful than a street gang. A criminal empire that would be run like a business and put the organized in organized crime. By 1931, an ambitious young gangster named Lucky Luciano had killed off New York's two most powerful Italian dons. Now he was ready to change the face of organized crime. He called together all his young compatriots and rivals in New York's Italian underworld, fellow immigrants like Carlo Gambino, Joe Bonanno, Tommy Lucchese, and Joe Profaci. He proposed that the city's rackets be divided among 5 crime families, with the boss of each family serving on a board of directors known as the Commission.
The idea was to run everything as an absolute business-like proposition. No one had any exclusive control over any particular racket. And that if there were problems, people were not to pull out guns and start shooting one another. They would have come before this body, the Commission, which then would issue a final decree.
This gives the Mafia a new national scope and a certain order and continuity that no other criminal gang has. The Irish and Jewish gangsters don't have a Mafia, and then they don't have a commission to organize and make the Mafia a bit more coherent.
Though the bosses on the Commission all had the same amount of power, Luciano would be the first among equals.
Luciano had a certain quality of personal leadership. It wasn't that he was more violent than the other guys. They were all stone killers who loved to kill people and loved to tell war stories about it afterward. It wasn't that he was more dangerous. He was just somehow deferred to.
Luciano enlisted longtime associates Vito Genovese and Frank Costello to help run his own family. The thug Genovese would be in charge of the muscle, while the cunning Costello would manage the family's hold on Tammany Hall. Through gambling, narcotics, and extortion rackets, the family was soon bringing in more money than many large corporations.
The Genovese crime family commanded great amounts of two of the principal things that made the wheels turn in New York at that time. One was the threat of violence and the ability to command fear in men, and the other was tremendous amounts of money.
At the age of 34, Lucky Luciano, who had come to America as a poor Sicilian immigrant, was New York City's most powerful gangster.
He loved being Charlie Lucky Luciano, the #1 gangster in town, and he liked to be seen and celebrated. He was always beautifully dressed, expensive cars and jewelry, expensive women, expensive places.
Luciano frequented New York hotspots like the Stork Club and rubbed elbows with movie stars, politicians, and beautiful women. The multimillionaire always carried a fat wad of cash to keep the party rolling.
He lived in a very lavish style in a penthouse suite at the Waldorf Astoria. And it's almost as if he began to savor this kind of notoriety. And there were people around him who tried to warn him, Charlie, this is not smart. Once you make yourself that visible, you become a target.